If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, hit that subscribe button right now and give this video a like. We cover the most significant criminal investigations and geopolitical crime stories from around the world, and what we're about to walk through today is one of the most consequential operations in the history of organized crime in the Western Hemisphere. For years, he was considered untouchable, a ghost, a shadow that moved through the mountains of Jalisco, while governments on both sides of the border spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to find him. The United States Department of State offered $15 million for information leading to his capture, the same reward they offer for some of the world's most dangerous terrorists. Interpol had his name on their most wanted list. The DEA dedicated entire task forces to tracking his movements. Mexican security forces conducted operation after operation in the territories he controlled. And for years, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, the man the world knew as El Mencho, walked free, until a woman visited him in Tapalpa. On Sunday, February 22, 2026, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, founder and leader of the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, the most powerful drug trafficking organization in Mexico and one of the primary suppliers of fentanyl to the United States, was captured and killed during a military operation in the municipality of Tapalpa in the state of Jalisco. The operation, conducted by Mexican Army forces, the National Guard, Special Forces units, and supported by United States intelligence assets, ended the reign of one of the most feared and most wanted criminals in the history of North American organized crime. But the story of how they found him, the operational intelligence that cracked a security apparatus that had protected El Mencho for decades, begins not with a satellite, not with a wiretap, not with a paid informant in the cartel's inner circle. It begins with a woman who visited the man she loved and someone who noticed. This is the story of El Mencho's final mistake. To understand why the intelligence breakthrough in Tapalpa was so significant, you need to understand who El Mencho was, what he had built, and why finding him had been so extraordinarily difficult for so long. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was born in 1966 in the municipality of Tierra Caliente in Michoacán, a region that has been a center of Mexican organized crime for decades. His path into the criminal world followed a trajectory that investigators would later recognize as a template: early involvement in drug trafficking, connections to established criminal organizations, and a capacity for violence that distinguished him from other operators in the field. What made El Mencho different from the generation of cartel leaders who preceded him, the Pablo Escobars, the Felix Gallardos, the Chapo Guzmans, was not just his capacity for violence, though that capacity was extraordinary. It was his organizational vision. El Mencho understood something that the previous generation of cartel leaders had learned through catastrophic failure: that an organization built around a single dominant personality, a charismatic leader whose authority derived from personal power and personal relationships, was an organization with a structural vulnerability at its very center. Kill or capture the leader, and you could potentially collapse the organization. El Mencho built the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, the CJNG, with a different model in mind. The cartel would have military-style discipline. It would have specialized units for different functions: trafficking, security, financial operations, and the kind of violent enforcement that established territorial control and sent messages to rivals and authorities alike. It would have a presence not just in Mexico, but across international drug markets, with connections to suppliers in South America, distribution networks across the United States, and routes to Europe and Asia. Under El Mencho's leadership, the CJNG became the dominant supplier of fentanyl to the United States market, the synthetic opioid that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans in the ongoing overdose crisis. This made the cartel not just a Mexican law enforcement problem, but an American national security priority. The $15 million reward offered by the U.S. State Department reflected the seriousness with which Washington viewed El Mencho's operation. His security arrangements were correspondingly sophisticated. El Mencho moved constantly. He maintained multiple safe houses across the territories his cartel controlled. His inner circle was small, carefully selected, and brutally policed. Any hint of disloyalty was met with consequences that reinforced the risks of cooperation with authorities. His communications were conducted through methods designed to minimize electronic surveillance. He rarely appeared in public, rarely stayed in any single location long enough for intelligence to solidify into actionable information. For years, this worked. Law enforcement on both sides of the border developed intelligence about El Mencho, his habits, his associates, his general areas of operation, but converting that intelligence into a precise location at a specific time, which is what you need to conduct an operation, remained elusive. Until the intelligence came not from surveillance technology or informants within the cartel, but from something far more human and far more difficult to protect against. Make sure you've subscribed to this channel and hit that like button. We'll be covering every development in the aftermath of El Mencho's death, and the story is far from over. The operation that killed El Mencho began taking shape on Saturday, February 21st, the day before the raid. According to Mexican authorities, investigators had been tracking a person close to El Mencho. That person was his girlfriend, and on Saturday, she visited him at a property in Tapalpa. Tapalpa is a small municipality in the highlands of Jalisco, a scenic area known for its pine forests and its distance from the urban centers where law enforcement presence is heaviest. It is the kind of location that someone trying to stay off the grid might choose. Remote enough to provide security but accessible enough to maintain the communications and logistics that running a major criminal organization requires. El Mencho had chosen it as a location where he could be relatively secure. What he had not fully accounted for was that someone in the orbit of the woman who visited him would notice and would talk. Mexican authorities have stated that information about El Mencho's whereabouts came from someone close to his girlfriend, a person who either knew that she was visiting him, saw her traveling to the location, or had some other form of knowledge about her destination. That person provided the information to investigators, setting in motion the chain of events that would end with El Mencho's death the following morning. This is the intelligence breakthrough that made everything else possible. Not a technical achievement, not years of surveillance technology converging on a precise location. A human source, someone who knew something and chose to share it with law enforcement. After the girlfriend left Tapalpa, intelligence services, including, according to a U.S. defense official who spoke to Reuters, a task force dedicated to collecting intelligence on cartels, confirmed that El Mencho was still at the property, protected by security personnel. The confirmation was critical. Acting on unverified intelligence in an operation of this sensitivity carries enormous risks, both operational and diplomatic. Authorities needed to be certain before they moved. With confirmation in hand, the operation began to assemble on Saturday evening. The Mexican army deployed troops to the region in what authorities described as a covert operation, designed to get forces into position around Tapalpa without alerting El Mencho's security apparatus to the incoming threat. Participants included members of the National Guard, Special Forces units, military aircraft, and 6 helicopters. The scale of the deployment reflected both the significance of the target and the expected resistance. Because the CJNG was not an organization that would allow its leader to be taken without a fight. The intelligence about El Mencho's girlfriend and her visit to Tapalpa is the detail that has captured the most attention in the days since the operation, and for good reason. It represents a category of vulnerability that is extraordinarily difficult for criminal organizations to protect against, no matter how sophisticated their security arrangements. Criminal organizations, particularly at the leadership level, invest enormous resources in operational security. Communications are encrypted or conducted through intermediaries. Movements are irregular and unpredictable. Associates are vetted for loyalty. The physical environment is controlled to minimize exposure to outside observation. These measures are designed to prevent law enforcement from developing the kind of specific actionable intelligence, a precise location at a precise time, that makes an operation possible. But these measures operate on assumptions about where the threat comes from. They assume the threat comes from law enforcement surveillance, electronic monitoring, physical observation, infiltration by informants within the organization. What they cannot fully protect against is the human dimension, the relationships, the emotional connections, the personal lives of the people at the center of the organization. El Mencho was, before he was a cartel leader, a human being. He had relationships. He had people in his life whose presence he valued, whose visits he permitted, whose access to his location represented a departure from the strict operational security that had protected him for years. His girlfriend visiting him in Tapalpa was not a tactical decision. It was a human one. And it created a thread, her travel to the location, the knowledge of someone in her orbit, that investigators were able to follow. This pattern, where the human relationships of high-value criminal targets create intelligence opportunities that sophisticated security measures cannot fully prevent, is one of the most consistent themes in the history of major law enforcement operations against organized crime. Pablo Escobar was located when Colombian intelligence tracked a phone call he made to his family. Osama bin Laden was found through the identification of his courier, a trusted member of his inner circle whose movements eventually led investigators to the compound in Abbottabad. In case after case, it is not the technical surveillance that ultimately cracks the target's security. It is the human connection that proves impossible to fully sever. Subscribe to this channel and give this video a like. This case has implications that extend far beyond Mexico, and we'll be covering every development as it unfolds. Before dawn on Sunday, February 22nd, Mexican ground forces moved to surround the area in Tapalpa, where El Mencho was located. The operation had maintained sufficient secrecy that El Mencho and his security personnel did not appear to have advance warning of the closing cordon. When the military moved, the cartel's security force responded. 8 armed individuals affiliated with the CJNG died in the initial confrontation with military forces, a firefight that demonstrated both the firepower that El Mencho's personal security team maintained and the military capacity that the operation had deployed. This was not a police operation in the conventional sense. This was a military engagement conducted with the weapons, training, and coordination of armed forces rather than law enforcement. El Mencho, along with surviving members of his security detail, retreated into a forested area adjacent to the location, an escape route that his security planning had presumably designated as a fallback position. A second confrontation occurred in the forest. When that confrontation concluded, military forces found El Mencho wounded, along with 2 of his security personnel. The decision to take him alive rather than kill him at the scene reflected the operational priorities of the Mexican government and its American partners. A living El Mencho represented intelligence, information about the cartel's structure, its operations, its financial networks, its relationships with corrupt officials, and the identities of the individuals positioned to succeed him. The value of that intelligence in terms of the ongoing effort to dismantle the CJNG was potentially enormous. A helicopter was dispatched to transport El Mencho and the wounded security personnel to a hospital. The destination was initially Guadalajara, Jalisco's capital and the nearest major city with appropriate medical facilities. But by the time the helicopter was airborne, something was already happening in the streets below that would change the calculus of the transport operation. The CJNG was retaliating. The death of El Mencho, or the news of his capture, which spread through the cartel's networks faster than Mexican authorities could manage the public information environment, triggered an immediate and violent response from the organization he had built. Across multiple Mexican states, cartel members and affiliated groups launched coordinated attacks on infrastructure, civilian areas, and in some cases on symbols of government authority. Roadblocks appeared on highways. Vehicles were set on fire. Gunfire erupted in urban areas that had previously been relatively insulated from direct cartel violence. An airport in Jalisco was targeted. The scale and coordination of the violence demonstrated something significant about the CJNG's organizational capacity. Even without El Mencho, even in the immediate aftermath of losing their founder, the organization retained sufficient command structure to execute a coordinated violent response across a wide geographic area simultaneously. The helicopter carrying El Mencho was diverted. Guadalajara was no longer a safe destination. The violence in the city and surrounding area made landing there operationally problematic. The aircraft was redirected to another city in an adjacent state, away from the most intense violence. During the flight, El Mencho died. The exact medical circumstances of his death, whether his wounds from the confrontation in Tapalpa were ultimately unsurvivable, or whether the delay and diversion of the helicopter contributed to the outcome, have not been fully detailed by Mexican authorities. His body was subsequently placed on a military aircraft and transported to Mexico City, where the government could control the confirmation of his death and manage the public communication around one of the most significant law enforcement achievements in recent Mexican history. More than 70 people died in the wave of violence that followed El Mencho's death. 70 lives ended because a cartel demonstrated its capacity for retaliatory violence, even in the moment of losing its founder. This dimension of the story, the human cost of the CJNG's response, is essential to understanding what El Mencho had built and what his death means for Mexico. If you're finding this channel for the first time, subscribe right now and hit the like button. We cover investigations like this with the depth and context they deserve. The immediate response by the CJNG to El Mencho's death, the roadblocks, the fires, the attacks on infrastructure, the more than 70 deaths, created a paradox that analysts examining the case have noted with significant interest. The very violence that demonstrated the cartel's continued organizational capacity simultaneously undermined its long-term position in ways that El Mencho himself had apparently understood. Roberto Uchoa, a former Brazilian federal police officer and researcher at the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra in Portugal, articulated this paradox in analysis published after the operation. The CJNG's violent retaliation, attacking airports, blocking roads, engaging in open confrontation with state authority, is precisely the kind of behavior that the organization's Brazilian counterparts, particularly the First Command of the capital, known as the PCC, have deliberately moved away from. The PCC, Uchoa argues, learned a lesson from their own violent confrontation with the Brazilian state in 2006, when the organization launched coordinated attacks across São Paulo that paralyzed the city for days. That operation demonstrated the PCC's power. It also demonstrated that direct, open confrontation with state authority is, in the long run, financially damaging and strategically counterproductive. It invites the kind of sustained, intensive law enforcement response that makes operations difficult and leadership vulnerable. After 2006, the PCC shifted its approach. Violence became what Uchoa describes as utilitarian, deployed strategically for specific purposes to send specific messages rather than as an open demonstration of power against the state. The killing of Vinicius Gritzbach, a PCC informant killed at São Paulo's Guarulhos International Airport in 2024, is an example of this approach. A targeted, purposeful act with a specific message, not a broad attack on civilian infrastructure. The CJNG's response to El Mencho's death did the opposite. It was demonstrative violence, the kind that sends a message of power, but also hands authorities, particularly American authorities, exactly the argument they have been seeking. Donald Trump's administration has been pursuing the designation of major Mexican cartels as terrorist organizations, a designation that would significantly expand the legal authorities available to the United States government to take action against cartel operations and cartel-affiliated individuals. The CJNG's response to El Mencho's death, with its attacks on airports and civilian infrastructure, provides the evidentiary basis for exactly the kind of terrorist designation the Trump administration has been seeking. The cartel, in demonstrating its power, may have provided the political and legal ammunition for a significantly more aggressive international response to its operations. This is the kind of strategic miscalculation that El Mencho himself might have prevented. Whether the violence of the immediate aftermath reflects a cartel that is already fragmenting, already losing the discipline that centralized leadership provides, or whether it was a deliberate decision by whoever now holds authority within the organization, is a question that analysts will be examining in the weeks and months ahead. Subscribe and hit the like button if you want to continue following this story. The implications of El Mencho's death will be playing out for years, and we'll be here to cover every development. The death of El Mencho does not mean the end of the CJNG. Criminal organizations of this scale and complexity do not simply dissolve when their founders die. The cartel's infrastructure, its trafficking routes, its relationships with suppliers in South America, its distribution networks in the United States, its financial operations, its corrupted relationships with officials at various levels of government, does not disappear with the man who built it. What changes is the leadership structure. And for the CJNG, this is where the most significant uncertainty lies. Unlike some criminal organizations that have developed systematic succession planning, formal or informal structures that identify and prepare the next generation of leadership before the current leadership is gone, the CJNG was built around El Mencho in ways that make succession genuinely uncertain. His leadership was personal, charismatic, and authority-based. The organization's military-style discipline reflected his vision and his enforcement. The question of who, if anyone, has both the authority and the organizational support to assume control of the entire CJNG, rather than just a portion of it, is one that cartel members, law enforcement agencies, and criminal analysts are all currently trying to answer. Uchoa outlines three possibilities. The first and most likely, in his assessment, is balkanization, a fragmentation of the cartel into smaller competing factions as regional commanders who previously operated under El Mencho's authority now compete for control of the whole organization. This is the pattern that followed the arrest of El Chapo and the disruption of the Sinaloa cartel, a period of internal conflict and fragmentation that generated enormous violence but ultimately resulted in a reorganized criminal landscape. The second possibility is absorption, that the CJNG, or significant portions of it, is absorbed by a rival organization, most likely the Sinaloa cartel, which has historically been the CJNG's primary competitor for territorial and market control in Mexico. Absorption would reduce intercartel conflict, but would dramatically increase the power of whichever organization absorbs CJNG's resources and routes. The third possibility is successful internal succession, that a figure within the CJNG's existing command structure has sufficient authority, support, and organizational capacity to assume effective control of the whole organization and maintain its cohesion through the transition period. This is the outcome that law enforcement most wants to prevent, because a successful succession maintains the CJNG as a unified, operational organization, rather than creating the fragmentation and weakness that the other scenarios generate. The chaos of the violence following El Mencho's death suggests that the third scenario, clean, controlled succession, may already be off the table. Organizations undergoing controlled leadership transitions do not typically respond to that transition with uncoordinated violence across multiple states that simultaneously kills civilians, destroys infrastructure, and provides political ammunition to foreign governments seeking to expand their authority to act against the organization. What the violence suggests instead is that the CJNG's response to El Mencho's death was reactive rather than planned, the expression of an organization in shock rather than one executing a succession protocol developed in advance. The geopolitical implications of the power vacuum El Mencho's death creates extend well beyond Mexico's borders, and this is where the story becomes particularly significant for anyone trying to understand the future of organized crime in the Western Hemisphere. The CJNG was not just a Mexican cartel operating in Mexican territory. It was a transnational criminal organization with operations across multiple continents. Its trafficking routes served markets in the United States, Europe, and Asia. Its operations in South America, including illegal mining activities in Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador, and involvement in the mercury trade that has devastated the Amazon ecosystem, gave it a presence across the region. Its financial operations moved money through networks that spanned multiple jurisdictions. All of that infrastructure now exists in a state of uncertainty. The organizations that relied on the CJNG as a partner, a supplier, or a logistics provider are now evaluating their options. The territories and routes that the CJNG controlled are now potentially available to whoever can establish sufficient authority to take them. And according to analysts like Roberto Ochoa, the organization best positioned to fill that vacuum is not another Mexican cartel. It is a Brazilian one. The PCC, the first command of the capital, is, by Ochoa's analysis, the most sophisticated and resilient criminal organization currently operating in the Western Hemisphere. Its organizational structure, modeled more on a corporation than on the personality-driven hierarchies of traditional cartels, gives it a resilience that organizations built around charismatic leadership cannot match. Its leadership collective, the Sintonia Final, which includes the imprisoned Marcola, has guided the organization's strategic direction for years without any individual leader becoming the kind of singular target whose elimination could dismantle the whole operation. The PCC already controls significant portions of the cocaine trafficking route to Europe, the same routes that the CJNG was operating. It is in a position of continuous expansion. And its organizational model, professional, disciplined, strategic about violence in ways that the CJNG demonstrably is not, makes it an attractive partner for the criminal networks that are currently evaluating their options in the post-El Mencho landscape. Subscribe now and give this video a like. The story of what happens next, in Mexico and Brazil and across the international drug trade, is one we'll be following closely on this channel. The American dimension of this story is impossible to separate from the operational and geopolitical analysis. The United States was not a passive observer of the operation that killed El Mencho. A U.S. defense official confirmed to Reuters that an American intelligence task force focused on cartel operations participated in the operation. The $15 million reward that had been on offer for years reflected the American government's assessment of El Mencho as a priority target. For the Trump administration, El Mencho's death is a significant achievement, one that can be presented as evidence that the administration's pressure on Mexico to take more aggressive action against cartel organizations is producing results. El Mencho was not just a drug trafficker. He was the primary architect of the fentanyl supply chain that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. His death removes a specific individual from that supply chain. But as Ochoa observes with characteristic directness, this is where the American framing of the operation begins to diverge from the more complex reality. The fentanyl crisis in the United States is not primarily a supply problem. It is a demand problem. Americans consume fentanyl in quantities that create the market that organizations like the CJNG exist to serve. Eliminating the CJNG, even if the entire organization were somehow dismantled overnight, which it has not been, would not eliminate the market. It would create a temporary disruption in supply that would be filled by other organizations, whether the Sinaloa Cartel, the PCC, or organizations we do not yet know about. The United States is also the primary source of the weapons that arm the CJNG and organizations like it. The flow of firearms from American gun dealers across the border into Mexico, a trafficking operation that moves in the opposite direction from the drug trade, provides the military-grade weaponry that allowed El Mencho security force to engage Mexican army troops in firefights. American gun trafficking to Mexico is a law enforcement and policy failure that the Trump administration's focus on cartel violence has not seriously addressed. Ochoa describes this as American hypocrisy, the United States presenting itself as a partner in fighting cartel violence while simultaneously being the primary consumer market for cartel products and the primary source of cartel weapons. The death of El Mencho fits neatly into a narrative of American success in the drug war. The structural conditions that make organizations like the CJNG possible, American drug demand, American gun supply, remain unchanged. There is also the question of what happens when the CJNG's post-El Mencho violence is used to advance the terrorist designation agenda that Trump's administration has been pursuing. If the cartel, or its most violent factions, continues to engage in attacks on civilian infrastructure and government targets, the legal and political basis for designating the CJNG as a terrorist organization becomes stronger. That designation would expand American legal authority to act against cartel operations and cartel-affiliated individuals in ways that current law does not permit. For Mexico, this is a complicated prospect. The Mexican government has historically been protective of its sovereignty, resistant to American interference in domestic law enforcement operations, even when American assistance is practically necessary. A terrorist designation of major Mexican cartels by the United States government would significantly expand American authority to take unilateral action against those organizations in ways that could impinge on Mexican sovereignty in uncomfortable ways. El Mencho, according to analysts who have studied the CJNG, understood this dynamic. His organization's discipline, its relative restraint in terms of direct confrontation with the Mexican state, compared to organizations like the Sinaloa Cartel during its most violent periods, reflected a strategic awareness of the political and legal risks of providing the American government with the justification it seeks. Whether the individuals who now control the CJNG's various factions share that strategic awareness, or whether the immediate response to his death is a preview of how the organization will operate going forward, is one of the most consequential questions in the current landscape of North American organized crime. The human story at the center of all of this geopolitical analysis is the intelligence breakthrough in Tapalpa. A woman visited the man she loved. Someone who knew about that visit told investigators, and the most wanted man in North American organized crime was found. In the history of law enforcement operations against major criminal organizations, this kind of human intelligence, the personal relationship that creates the operational thread, appears again and again as the decisive factor. The $15 million reward, the years of technical surveillance, the dedicated task forces, none of these produced a precise location at a precise time. A woman's visit to a man in a small town in the Jalisco highlands produced what years of sophisticated intelligence work could not. This tells us something important about the nature of criminal security and its limits. El Mencho built an organization with extraordinary operational discipline, He survived for years while being hunted by 2 governments and a multinational law enforcement effort. But he could not fully sever the human connections that are, ultimately, part of what it means to be a person, rather than just a target. Whether the woman who visited him knew that she was being watched, whether she understood that her visit was providing the intelligence that would lead to his death, whether she made a deliberate choice to be in Tapalpa that day, knowing what it might mean. These are questions that remain unanswered in the public record. What is known is that someone connected to that visit chose to share information with investigators, and that choice, whatever its motivation, ended the reign of El Mencho. Subscribe to Case Decoded and hit the like button. We analyze the investigations that shape our world, and this case is one of the most significant of the decade. Your support helps us bring you this depth of coverage on every story we tackle. The days and weeks ahead will be critical to understanding what El Mencho's death actually means for the trajectory of organized crime in Mexico, in the United States, and across the Western Hemisphere. The violence that followed his death has begun to subside as Mexican security forces respond to the CJNG's retaliatory attacks. But the underlying dynamics, the succession struggle, the territorial disputes, the route competitions, the relationships with suppliers and partners across South America and Europe, are playing out in ways that will shape the criminal landscape for years. Law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border are using the window created by the CJNG's disruption to pursue intelligence and operational opportunities that the organization's full operational capacity would have made more difficult. The identities of individuals positioned for succession, the locations of key infrastructure, the financial networks that move the cartel's money, all of these represent investigative targets that the disruption of El Mencho's death has potentially made more accessible. The PCC, meanwhile, is watching, evaluating. Its organizational model, disciplined, corporate, strategically restrained in its use of violence, positions it as the kind of stable partner that criminal networks currently working with the CJNG will find attractive as the Mexican cartel undergoes whatever reorganization follows its founder's death. Whether the PCC moves aggressively to fill the vacuum El Mencho's death has created, or whether it proceeds cautiously to avoid attracting the kind of attention that aggressive expansion would generate, will be a significant indicator of where the global drug trade is heading. El Mencho is gone. The organization he built is in transition. The routes he controlled, the relationships he maintained, the market he served, all of these continue. The question is not whether the drug trade continues after El Mencho. It is who fills the space he occupied, and what that means for the millions of people whose lives are affected by the operations of criminal organizations at every level of the supply chain. The story begins with a woman visiting a man in Tapalpa. It ends, at least this chapter of it, with a body on a military aircraft bound for Mexico City, and a country grappling with the violence of an organization that demonstrated, even in the moment of losing its founder, that it retains the capacity to make life dangerous for ordinary people who had nothing to do with the criminal enterprise their government was fighting to dismantle. Stay with us on Case Decoded as this story continues to develop. Subscribe, hit the like button, share this video with anyone who wants to understand the real story behind one of the most significant criminal investigations of our time. We will be back with the next development as soon as it breaks. Thank you for watching. To fully appreciate the significance of the Tapalpa operation, it is worth examining the history of the CJNG itself, because understanding what El Mencho built is essential to understanding what his death means, and why the organization's future is so uncertain. The Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación emerged as a distinct criminal organization in the early 2010s, separating from the Milenio Cartel and establishing itself as an independent force in the Mexican criminal landscape. Its rise was rapid and violent. Under El Mencho's leadership, the CJNG expanded aggressively into territories previously controlled by other organizations, using a combination of military-style violence and strategic alliance building that distinguished it from more traditional cartel approaches. What made the CJNG distinctive was its operational model. Where earlier Mexican cartels had operated primarily as trafficking organizations, focused on moving drugs from production points in South America through Mexico and into the United States, the CJNG developed a more vertically integrated structure. It maintained relationships with South American cocaine producers. It ran its own methamphetamine and fentanyl production operations, reducing dependence on external suppliers. It controlled trafficking routes rather than simply using routes controlled by others. And it maintained a military capacity, armed with military-grade weapons, organized in military-style units, and willing to engage in direct confrontation with Mexican security forces. That made it qualitatively different from the criminal organizations that had preceded it. The fentanyl dimension of the CJNG's operation became particularly significant in the context of the American opioid crisis. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid approximately 50 times more potent than heroin, became the dominant driver of overdose deaths in the United States during the 2010s and 2020s. The CJNG was identified as one of the primary suppliers of fentanyl to the American market, manufacturing the drug in clandestine laboratories in Mexico and trafficking it across the border through the established routes the cartel controlled. The death toll associated with fentanyl trafficking is staggering. Tens of thousands of Americans die every year from synthetic opioid overdoses. The communities affected are not limited to any particular demographic or geographic area. Fentanyl has penetrated virtually every segment of American society. This reality is what made El Mencho a $15 million target rather than simply a significant Mexican law enforcement problem. He was, in a very direct sense, responsible for a significant portion of those deaths. Whether his death will reduce the flow of fentanyl into the United States is, as analysts have noted, far from certain. The production capacity, the trafficking infrastructure, and the market demand all exist independently of El Mencho himself. Disrupting the leadership of the organization that has been running this supply chain creates uncertainty and potential operational disruption in the short term. Whether it produces a lasting reduction in supply depends on whether the CJNG can be prevented from successfully reorganizing its fentanyl operation under new leadership, and on whether law enforcement can identify and disrupt the infrastructure before it reconstitutes itself. The intelligence cooperation between the United States and Mexico that made the Tapalpa operation possible represents a model of bilateral law enforcement collaboration that has been under strain in recent years. The Trump administration's aggressive rhetoric about Mexico, including the tariff threats and the push for cartel terrorist designations, created diplomatic tensions that complicated the kind of quiet, sustained intelligence cooperation that produced the breakthrough in the El Mencho case. The fact that the operation happened despite those tensions reflects something important. The operational-level relationship between American and Mexican law enforcement and intelligence agencies is more resilient than the political-level relationship. Agencies that have worked together for years, that have developed trust and operational protocols, continue to function even when the political environment is difficult. The U.S. defense official who confirmed American involvement in the operation to Reuters was describing a relationship that exists below the level of presidential rhetoric. This operational relationship is also what makes the bilateral drug war both more effective and more complicated than political conversations about it typically acknowledge. American intelligence assets can provide capabilities, surveillance technology, signals intelligence, analytical resources that Mexican law enforcement cannot match on its own. Mexican intelligence can provide local knowledge, human sources, and operational access that American agencies cannot replicate. Together, they can produce outcomes like the Tapalpa operation. Separately, neither could have achieved the same result. The woman at the center of this story, El Mencho's girlfriend, whose visit to Tapalpa set the operation in motion, occupies a complicated position in the narrative. Her identity has not been made public by Mexican authorities. Whether she was aware that her movements were being monitored, whether she had any role, intentional or otherwise, in providing the intelligence that led to El Mencho's death, and what her circumstances are in the aftermath of the operation, are all questions that remain outside the public record. What is known is that someone in her orbit, someone who knew she was visiting El Mencho, or who knew his location through some connection to her visit, provided that information to investigators. This person made a choice. That choice, whatever the motivation behind it, fear, conscience, financial incentive, personal grievance, or some combination, is what made everything else possible. In the history of law enforcement intelligence, the motivations of human sources are rarely simple. People provide information to authorities for complicated reasons that often have little to do with civic duty or moral conviction. They may be afraid. They may be seeking protection for themselves or someone they love. They may have been deceived about what the information would be used for. They may have a personal stake in the outcome that has nothing to do with law enforcement objectives. Understanding the motivation of the source who provided the Tapalpa intelligence is important not just for historical completeness, but because it affects assessments of the reliability of the information and the circumstances under which it was obtained. Mexican authorities and their American partners have not publicly addressed the source's motivation or the circumstances of the intelligence sharing. This is standard practice. Protecting human sources is essential to maintaining the relationships that make future intelligence possible. If the person who provided information about El Mencho's location is identified, they face consequences that would deter any future source from providing similar information. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so now and give this video a like. Case Decoded is committed to bringing you this level of analysis on every significant investigation we cover. The broader lesson of the Tapalpa operation for criminal organizations goes beyond the specific vulnerabilities of the CJNG or of El Mencho as an individual. It speaks to a fundamental tension in the operation of criminal organizations at the highest level, the tension between operational security and human connection. Criminal organizations at the leadership level require both. Operational security requires isolation, limited personal relationships, constant movement, encrypted communications, and the ruthless elimination of any vulnerability that could be exploited by law enforcement. Human connection, relationships, trust, loyalty, love is what makes the organization function. Leaders need people they can trust. They need relationships that sustain them personally as well as professionally. And those relationships, by their very nature, create the kind of human vulnerabilities that sophisticated intelligence operations can exploit. El Mencho survived for years by maintaining extraordinary operational security while preserving enough human connection to sustain both his personal life and his organizational effectiveness. The visit from his girlfriend in Tapalpa was a moment where that human connection created a vulnerability that operational security could not fully protect against. The lesson for criminal organizations is not that human relationships are operationally unacceptable. Organizations run entirely on operational paranoia rather than human trust tend to collapse from internal dysfunction before law enforcement can reach them. The lesson is more nuanced, that every human connection is a potential intelligence vulnerability, and that the accumulation of those connections over time increases the probability that one of them will eventually produce the information that brings an organization down. El Mencho lasted longer than most. The $15 million reward, the years of surveillance, the dedicated task forces, none of them produced the decisive intelligence. A human connection did, and that is, ultimately, the most consistent theme in the history of law enforcement operations against organized crime. Not the technology, not the resources, not the legal authorities, but the human thread that finally unravels the security that everything else has been unable to penetrate. The Mexico that exists in the weeks after El Mencho's death is a country processing the implications of a significant law enforcement achievement and a significant humanitarian disaster simultaneously. More than 70 people are dead, not cartel members killed in military operations, but civilians caught in the violence of a criminal organization retaliating for the loss of its founder. Their deaths are part of the story of El Mencho's final days, and they deserve acknowledgement alongside the operational details of the Tapalpa raid. The families of those 70 people did not choose to be part of this story. They were living their lives in communities that became theaters of cartel violence because a criminal organization decided that the response to its leader's death should be expressed through attacks on the people and infrastructure of the country it operates in. This is what criminal organizations at the CJNG's level actually mean in practice, not just the abstracted geopolitics of drug trafficking routes and law enforcement cooperation, but the direct devastating impact on ordinary people who have no connection to the criminal enterprise beyond the misfortune of living in its territory. El Mencho built a powerful organization. He led it for years while being hunted by two governments. He died in a military operation triggered by a human intelligence breakthrough that his security apparatus could not prevent. The organization he built continues in disrupted and uncertain form. The drug trade continues. The violence continues. And 70 people who were alive before the Tapalpa operation are no longer alive. This is the complete picture of what happened in Jalisco in February of 2026. Not just the operational triumph, not just the geopolitical implications, but the full human cost of an operation that ended one chapter of organized crime in Mexico while opening several others whose outcomes remain to be determined. Stay subscribed to Case Decoded. Give this video a like and share it with anyone who wants to understand the real story behind the investigations and events that shape our world. When the next development in this case breaks, and there will be many, we will be here to cover it with the same depth and care that every story of this significance deserves. Thank you for watching. The operational details of what happened in Tapalpa on the morning of February 22nd will continue to emerge in the weeks and months ahead as journalists, researchers, and law enforcement officials piece together the complete picture of the operation. What is already clear is that it represents a watershed moment. Not the end of the CJNG, not the end of Mexican organized crime, not the resolution of the fentanyl crisis that has devastated American communities, but a moment of genuine disruption in a criminal landscape that had been remarkably stable for years. The succession struggle within the CJNG is now the central drama in Mexican organized crime. Regional commanders who spent years operating under El Mencho's authority are now evaluating their positions, calculating whether to seek alliance with a successor, assert independence, or seek accommodation with rival organizations. Each of these calculations involves violence, because in the criminal world, territorial and organizational disputes are settled through force. The violence that followed El Mencho's death is likely to continue as these calculations play out. For Mexican citizens living in CJNG-controlled territories, this period of uncertainty is dangerous in ways that are difficult to overstate. Criminal organizations that are engaged in succession struggles and internal conflicts tend to be more violent toward civilians than organizations with stable leadership, because discipline breaks down, because local commanders assert authority through fear rather than organizational structure, and because the uncertainty of the transition period creates incentives for individual actors to demonstrate power in ways that harm ordinary people. The Mexican government's response to the post-El Mencho violence, deploying security forces, seeking to maintain control in affected areas, managing the diplomatic dimension with the United States, will be a significant test of the Sheinbaum administration's capacity to capitalize on the operational achievement of El Mencho's death without allowing the resulting violence to undermine the government's authority and public trust. For American policymakers, the Tapalpa operation provides a moment to reassess the overall strategy of the drug war, to ask whether the kingpin strategy, the focus on eliminating individual leaders, is producing the outcomes that justify its costs. The history of these operations suggests that the answer is complicated. El Chapo's extradition did not end the Sinaloa cartel. Pablo Escobar's death did not end Colombian cocaine trafficking. Each of these operations disrupted organizations, created periods of violence, and ultimately resulted in reorganized criminal landscapes that continued to supply drugs to market demand. El Mencho's death will likely follow the same pattern. The CJNG will reorganize. New leaders will emerge. The fentanyl supply chain will reconstitute itself, potentially under different ownership but serving the same market. The $15 million reward was earned. The operational achievement was real. The structural conditions that make organizations like the CJNG possible, American demand, American weapons, the economic incentives of drug trafficking, remain unchanged. This is the honest assessment of what El Mencho's death means and does not mean. It is a significant achievement. It is not a solution. And the next chapter, the succession struggle, the CJNG's reorganization, the potential rise of the PCC in the spaces the Mexican cartel vacates, the ongoing impact on communities in Mexico and the United States, will be the story that determines whether the operation in Tapalpa produces lasting change or simply reshuffles the criminal landscape without addressing the underlying dynamics that drive it. Case Decoded will be following every development. Subscribe to this channel. Give this video a like. Share it with anyone who wants to understand not just what happened in Tapalpa, but why it happened, what it means, and what comes next. We cover investigations with the depth and context they deserve, because these stories matter, and the people affected by them deserve analysis that goes beyond the headlines. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video.